Primero, partir agradeciendo la presencia de todos ustedes. Quisiéramos saludar al presidente del Club Palestino, Mauricio Hamid, presidente de la Federación Palestina de Chile, Mauricio Pugoch, de las autoridades presentes y a sus honorables directores, por supuesto. La actividad de hoy se marca dentro de una semana de actividades que tenemos programadas en coordinación la Federación Palestina con la coordinadora del boicot Israel, BDS, junto a otras organizaciones colaboradoras. Hemos invitado a Frank Barat, activista francés por los derechos humanos, quien es además coordinador general del Tribunal Russell sobre Palestina. El Tribunal Russell, para los que recuerden, nace en la década de los 60 para investigar los crímenes que cometía Estados Unidos en Vietnam. Posteriormente, en los años 70, se constituye para observar los crímenes que se cometían en Latinoamérica, y en el año 2007 nace la idea de un Tribunal Russell para Palestina, para investigar los crímenes que comete a diario el Estado de Israel, así como la vulneración constante a los derechos humanos del pueblo palestino con esta ocupación que lleva más de 66 años, desde la creación misma del Estado de Israel sobre el territorio histórico palestino. En el año 2010 hubo 3 sesiones, entre el año 2010 y el año 2013, para investigar los crímenes que comete Israel, y recientemente en Bruselas, en septiembre, se realizó una sesión extraordinaria para investigar los crímenes que había cometido Israel en la franja de Gaza. La pregunta era un poco: ¿cometió Israel genocidio en la franja de Gaza? En esta investigación y en la constitución del Tribunal Russell participaron distintos juristas, ahora recientemente en Bruselas, así como distintos activistas y personalidades, desde Roger Waters hasta Richard Ford, que es ex asesor de Naciones Unidas sobre crímenes de guerra. En ese sentido, tenemos a Frank el día de hoy, que nos va a ilustrar sobre las conclusiones a las que ha llegado el tribunal, especialmente durante esta última sesión. El lema del Tribunal Russell es prevenir el crimen del silencio. En el fondo, lo que las instituciones y los organismos competentes, es decir, los distintos tribunales internacionales, no están realizando, lo realiza el Tribunal Russell, a pesar de que sus resoluciones no sean vinculantes. Bueno, lo voy a dejar en este momento con Nadia Silgi, que es de la coordinadora para el boicot a Israel, quien va a explicar la campaña del boicot, desinversión y sanciones como una... Bueno, ella va a hablar más sobre eso, para que voy a introducir yo.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
Gracias. Bueno, buenas tardes a todas, buenas tardes a todos. ¿No? Bueno, antes que todo quiero agradecer profundamente la presencia de Frank esta tarde con nosotros en representación de la campaña BDS, que es la campaña por el boicot, desinversión y sanciones en Israel. La verdad es que tomó largos meses hacer posible la visita de Frank. Agradezco a todos quienes con su trabajo la han hecho posible, y en particular agradezco a Frank por la paciencia, su buena disposición y sobre todo con su compromiso. En esta instancia, delante de todos ustedes, quiero expresarle cuánto lo admiro a él y cuánto admiro su trabajo, y agradecerle mucho que esté acá con nosotros. A todos ustedes, que son en su mayoría, como yo, palestinos de Chile, quiero manifestarles lo importante que es, en mi opinión, que estén acá esta tarde. De verdad creo fuertemente que lo que Frank tiene para contarnos es algo de lo cual debemos aprender para apoyar la lucha por la liberación del pueblo palestino. Es más, bueno, no es casual que la campaña BDS sea quien hace parte de la organización de esta actividad. Justamente la conclusión a la cual llega el Tribunal Russell para Palestina o Tribunal Internacional de Crímenes de Guerra estudiando el caso palestino es a un llamado a la sociedad civil internacional para justamente hacer un boicot a Israel. La campaña por el BDS brevemente surge en el año 2005 como un llamado de las organizaciones de la sociedad civil palestina. Hay más de 170 organizaciones comprometidas en este llamado, de distinto carácter, ¿no? Hay organizaciones sindicales, sociales, de mujeres, de trabajadores, etc. Y justamente se inspira esta campaña en el ejemplo sudafricano, ¿no? Mediante el cual, haciendo un boicot internacional a la Sudáfrica racista del apartheid, la sociedad internacional logró de esa manera apoyar la lucha que estaba liderando Nelson Mandela, entre otros, al interior de Sudáfrica. Y Sudáfrica consiguió ser independiente. El BDS llama a que todos desde nuestro lugar en la sociedad hagamos un boicot a Israel, principalmente, o no principalmente, sino que el boicot se desenvuelve en 4 pilares, como es el boicot económico, académico, cultural y político. Nosotros no boicoteamos a los judíos, ni siquiera boicoteamos a los israelíes. Lo que nosotros boicoteamos es la marca Israel, porque nosotros creemos que todo lo que produzca Israel, ya sean frutas, libros de investigación científica, armas, etc., se ha producido a costa del sacrificio del pueblo palestino. El Estado de Israel, para poder crearse, vació a Palestina de sus habitantes originarios, ¿no? Los árabes palestinos, lo que se ha conocido como la limpieza étnica de Palestina. El historiador palestino Nur Salha sostiene que cuando los líderes del movimiento sionista hablaban de una tierra sin pueblo para un pueblo sin tierra, en verdad no hacían una apreciación demográfica exacta, sino que se referían a que en Palestina no había ningún pueblo digno de ser considerado como tal, ¿no? En base a los intereses coloniales de la época y agrego yo a los intereses imperiales de hoy. Porque eso es lo que ha pretendido Israel, ¿no? Cambiar la configuración demográfica de Palestina. Eso es lo que le hace un apartheid, ¿no? Que es un crimen de lesa humanidad. Israel es un apartheid porque Israel no es el Estado de todos los habitantes de la tierra que ocupa, sino que Israel es el Estado de todos los judíos del mundo. Y eso está institucionalizado en Israel, no depende de uno u otro gobierno. Así es el Estado de Israel, así se creó y así es como se ha mantenido hasta el día de hoy. Bueno, con esto ya voy a terminar porque obviamente ustedes vinieron a escuchar a Frank y no a mí, pero en verdad no puedo dejar de decir que aquel concepto al cual apelamos como BDS es el concepto de normalización. Y de verdad quiero ser súper categórica en esto. Esto se refiere nada más ni nada menos que a que no podemos tener relaciones normales con un Estado que viola grave y sistemáticamente los derechos humanos del pueblo palestino. Por lo mismo, nosotros, menos que nadie, podemos validar la posición del sionismo internacional. No podemos dialogar con los sionistas, no podemos ver esto como un empate. Esto no es un empate, no es una guerra, tampoco es un conflicto. El lenguaje crea realidad. Esto es una limpieza étnica, un régimen de apartheid, un crimen de lesa humanidad, según el registro en que nos desenvolvamos. Esto no es simplemente una ocupación militar, y estoy segura que Frank va a poder ocuparlo mucho mejor, va a poder explicarlo mucho mejor que yo. Nosotros, yo creo, la comunidad palestina más grande fuera del Medio Oriente, incluso la tercera comunidad de Palestina, o sea, no sé si la tercera, pero la comunidad palestina más grande incluso fuera de Jordania, que es bastante decir, en un contexto como el latinoamericano, que ha sido tan solidario con el pueblo palestino, tenemos que dejar de usar el lenguaje en que se legitima la existencia y el proceder de Israel, en que se le castiga por abusos. Nosotros somos los encargados de guardar en el baúl palabras como paz, diálogo, civilización, conflicto, ocupación, coexistencia. Somos los encargados de poner en el tapete de familiarizarnos con la limpieza étnica, con el apartheid, con la segregación racial, con el concepto de dominación colonial. Nosotros estamos por la corresistencia. El nuestro no es un problema de intolerancia de sectores extremistas de ambos lados. Nosotros defendemos a un pueblo que es día a día víctima de las injusticias más atroces, de la desposesión. Un pueblo que han pretendido borrar de los mapas, de la historia, de las memorias, pero que sin embargo sigue resistiendo. Y nosotros, desde las ventajas que tenemos al vivir en Chile, a diferencia de quienes viven en Palestina, podemos alzar la voz y defender y ser parte de dicha resistencia. Esa resistencia, a mayor abundamiento, está legitimada incluso por el derecho internacional. Los palestinos tienen derecho a defenderse, a resistir. Israel no solo no tiene derecho a defenderse, sino que tanto potencia ocupante tiene la obligación jurídica de proteger a la población que ocupa. Como dice la activista palestina por el BDS Rania Masri, es verdad que el 70% de las personas asesinadas por Israel durante el último ataque a Gaza eran civiles. Pero sus muertes las lloramos tal como lloramos las muertes de ese otro 30%, de ese otro 30% que estaba combatiendo Israel, y nos sentimos profundamente orgullosos de ellos. El Tribunal Russell previene el crimen del silencio. Da una plataforma a la voz de quienes no tienen plataforma. Nosotros, como palestinos de Chile, debemos estrechar la mano a todos quienes trabajan por la liberación de Palestina en el mundo. Y tenemos que levantar nuestra voz. Nuestra voz como palestinos es válida. No necesitamos que otros vengan a hablar por nosotros. Necesitamos resistir todos en conjunto. Frank Barat y el Tribunal Russell para Palestina han entendido esto. Muchas gracias. Bueno, y ahora Frank.
Thanks, Nadia. Masal khair, everyone. Muchas gracias a Nadia, PDS Chile, Federación Palestina, y Club Palestino for having me tonight. It's a pleasure and an honor. I thank also Anwar and Nadia for their introductions. Nadia covered quite a lot in a very short space of time. I arrived on Monday, so it's like 3 days ago, and I had a long journey coming from Brussels. Was like a 20 hours pretty much journey, stopping in Amsterdam, then Buenos Aires, then finally Santiago de Chile. And on the plane, I had time to read this book about the Palestine, the Russell Tribunal on Latin America, which is a book called Repression in Latin America. As Anwar mentioned, this tribunal took place in 1975 and focused on the military governments of Chile, Bolivia, Argentina, and Uruguay. And the more I read about what happened in Latin America in these dark times, the more the similarities with Palestine became obvious. Violations of the right to life, the right to personal integrity, the right to have a fair trial, the right to protection from arbitrary detention, summary executions, torture, cultural repression, university closures were very common practice here in the 70s and the 80s. And this is obviously happening in Palestine and has happened in Palestine for also many years. I sat actually on the plane next to a very nice Chilean couple that had been forced to leave Chile for Norway in 1977, and they also told me how they spent time in jail, how they were tortured, and again the story of Palestine kept popping back in my head. Finally today I went to Villa Grimaldi to sort of learn more about the place, and I'm sure a lot of you have been to Villa Grimaldi, but it's such a haunting place because it's so beautiful. It's and so much horrible crimes have taken place in this place. So again, this repression and this torture and this humiliation has been happening in Palestine for many years as well. And already you start to see a pattern of, sort of a common struggle, that what happened in Chile in the 70s, in the 80s and 90s, what's happening in Palestine now. You can see the link, and it's very important to establish the sort of the common pattern and the sort of a global struggle for human beings. Yeah, a friend of mine also recently visited Palestine, and she spoke to political prisoners, or former political prisoners that had been released from jail since. She spoke to one man that had spent 27 years in jail, most of the time in solitary confinement, so with no access to other people, most of the time blindfolded. And he was saying that it was so difficult, and he felt so powerless that he wanted to kill himself, and but to do so he had very little means. So he was licking the bars of his cell with the hope that the rest of the bars will give him an illness or something, because he just couldn't take it anymore. So I think it's crucial to have spaces like Via Grimaldi, like Museo de la Memoria, to remember what happened and what is happening, but it's even more important to make sure that those type of crimes don't happen again. And this is exactly what the Russell Tribunal is trying to do. There is a space for this work of memory and this work of archive, but we need to use this to make sure that no other people around the world ever have to face such horrible suffering. Actually, being in Via Grimaldi reminded me of, I've never been to Guantanamo, but reminded me of Guantanamo Bay, of Abu Ghraib in Iraq, of all the secret jails that we know exist around the world, where people are taken from their home, flown to another country and tortured for months. So this is a pattern that hasn't stopped. The end of the Pinochet regime hasn't stopped other horrible crimes, and this pattern to be reproduced in other countries. Before I go into details about the Russell Tribunal, I wanted to talk about what's happening on the ground now in Palestine. I'm sure you know a lot already, but it's important to remind us and to remember that what's happening in Palestine nowadays and on the ground, I'm not talking only about Gaza, I'm talking about the West Bank and Jerusalem, and is really getting worse and worse. Jerusalem is becoming a symbol of how much Israel has turned into an apartheid state. Israel calls, they've got a tactic called the Judaization of Jerusalem. For Israel, Jerusalem belongs to Israel and has been annexed in 1968. More and more Israeli Jews are being, settled in East Jerusalem, in the old city. A lot of Palestinians are getting kicked out of their houses by settlers, protected by the army. A lot of Palestinians lose their right to residency in Jerusalem because they left for 3 months and they can't come back. And you heard recently that Israel, for the first time since 1967, had closed Al-Haram al-Sharif for Muslims and for prayers, which Mahmoud Abbas called this actually an act of war. And many people don't understand, but remember that the second Intifada also started at Al-Haram al-Sharif with when Ariel Sharon visited the place with military guards, etc. And I think it also shows that Israel is scared. Israel knows that world public opinion is behind Palestine. Israel has heard that Sweden has just recognized Palestine, that the UK might follow recently. I've also heard that France today is going to put forward a resolution to also recognize the Palestinian state. And Israel has lost the moral high ground, and Israel, as any state, and that is any state that is powerful but that is paranoid, like South Africa at the time, is reacting with more and more violence. And I think Israel right now, with what happened in Gaza during Operation Protective Edge, with what happens in Jerusalem every day, with what happens in the West Bank every day, is trying to force the Palestinian into a violent response, to then justify another war, another bombing, another assault. A problem that a lot of people forget, I'm sure you don't, but a lot of people forget, when they talk about Palestine, they mostly think Muslims and Jews. But you all know that Palestine is about Christians as well. And the Christian minority in Palestine has decreased year after year. I remember reading a report that Israel was saying it's because of the Muslims. The Muslims don't like the Christians, so the Christians are flying. We know it's not the case. I've spent many weeks in Bethlehem. I've spoken to Christians, Muslims, and the Christians, Palestinians told me, we're leaving because of the war, we're leaving because of the occupation, we're leaving because we're losing businesses every day. The Palestinian Christian minority has gone from 3.4% in the last 10 years to 2.1% in occupied Palestine. And so this is really a global issue. It's not about Muslims and Jews and Arabs. And it's a global issue. And the problem of the Christian minority should be addressed more forcefully by everyone. Finally, in Gaza, obviously the situation is worse than it's ever been. It's hard to put into words when you see the level of destruction that Israel has committed throughout the last war. Whole neighborhoods completely razed. So 1,500, I was reading that 1,500 children became orphans during the last offensive. So 1,500 children lost their mum and their dad in the summer. I was also, I read a report by the British Medical Journal that said that after Operation Gaslead, they did a study on the children of Gaza, and you all know that Gaza is nearly 60% children, 60% under 16. And the British Medical Journal came back with the conclusion that 72% of the children of Gaza had lost the will to live, were chronically depressed, and needed daily psychological help. I actually did the math recently, and it's the equivalent of 12 million people in France. I mean, I'm French, so I focus on French, but French is like 66 million or something. So it will be as if 12 million children in France had lost the will to live and needed psychological supervision every day. So it's a really radically wrong situation, and that's why when we had the Russell Tribunal that Anwar explained that we started in 2009, and our mandate was not to focus on Israel and to ask the question, is Israel guilty or not? Because we started from the basis that yes, Israel is guilty. We don't have to say it, the UN has said it, human rights organizations have said it, international law has said it. We wanted to talk about third parties, other states, or the enablers of Israel oppression, the enablers of Israel occupation, the states that provide Israel with the weapons, with the finance, with the diplomatic cover to actually do what it does. Because we all know the problem of Israel and the question of Palestine is mainly a problem of impunity. Israel is the only state in the, maybe not. Israel with the US and are the only state in the world that can violate international law on a daily basis, that can violate any basic principles of human rights, and Israel is actually rewarded for it, from it. People often say that the West remain silent in front of Israeli crimes, or the West is neutral, but it's not the case. The West is actively participating in Israeli crimes. They're not silent. They are completely behind Israel. We saw it after the beginning of Operation Protective Edge. Again, sorry, I'm focusing on France, but the day after the operation started, François Hollande called Netanyahu and told him pretty much, you have carte blanche. You can go, do whatever you want. And I wouldn't say I'm quite young, but I'm not. I'm 37, I'm getting old. But I don't recall any other instances where a country that is violating international law, and France and the US agree that Israel is, the settlement building is violating international law, gets applauded for it. It's there is such double standard when applied to Israel that then it's easy to understand why international solidarity, when civil society is behind Palestine. And a lot of people that actually defend Israel always ask you, why you focus on Israel? What about China? What about Rwanda? What about Iran? But Iran, Rwanda, and China don't benefit from the overwhelming support of the US, of France, so we are singling out Israel because the West is singling out Israel. And that's the bottom line. Finally, Amnesty, actually, I don't know if you heard, but Amnesty International today released a report saying that Israel committed war crimes during Operation Protective Edge, that there was a pattern of attack on civilian houses. And they studied 8 instances where the bombing of houses came without any warning, killed 100 civilians, including 62 children. And what's important, I think, in the Amnesty report is the pattern. It's not, it's not like a bad apple. You say it's a bad apple, maybe one bomb fell, oh, sorry, it's a mistake. There was a pattern of, sort of an institutionalized pattern of bombing civilian houses. So the Russell Tribunal on Palestine were from us, from a group of people from France, Belgium, and Palestine, a response that when there is like a lack of justice, a lack of actions from the powers in place, sort of arises the need from a popular tribunal. When the Palestinians have no recourse to justice, and when the Palestinians have no even the space to have their stories heard, it's down to us, the people, to take over from the governments. And because like the complicity of the governments in the case of Palestine is so incredible and big, we do have to do something. And Nadia talked about the BDS movement. I'll come back to this, but this is crucial that we have the tools to actually forcefully, from the outside as well, because Israel won't change from the inside. That's a myth. Let's talk. Let's have more talks with Israelis. That's a myth. A privileged people, a privileged state, won't renounce its privileges like this. It's never happened in history. South Africa, apartheid government didn't wake up one day saying, okay, the black people need to have rights. They did so because of the economic pressure, because of the boycott, because of the armed resistance, because of the peaceful resistance, and the pressure from outside. And that's exactly what needs to happen in Palestine. So we started the tribunal in 2009, once again, focusing on third-party complicity, who provides Israel with the support it needs to violate the rights of the Palestinian people. And so we talked about EU complicity, we talked about US complicity and UN complicity, the question of the US veto, the lack of democratic means of the UN, which is, as far as the Security Council is the most undemocratic institution in the world. The simple fact that Palestine can be recognized by 140 countries at the General Assembly, but that a single US veto means the resolution won't go through, is highly problematic. So the old question of how the UN works needs to be reframed, and the response of the UN, you can't say it's a complicity, it's mostly the UN has become this sort of useless institution. When you see Gaza, the UN schools, the UN depot being destroyed by Israel, and when you see Paul Ban Ki-moon saying, oh, I'm so sorry about this is terrible, it's not even you want to slap him in the face, because you feel it's such a puppet, with people in the background, don't say anything bad, So the question of the UN has to be reframed completely, and we have to remember that the UN Charter starts with we, the people. So the UN is supposed to be our institution. It doesn't say we, the corporations, or we, the states. It's we, the people. So that's another problem. And finally, we had one session, as I think, Anwar mentioned, on apartheid, and you both mentioned it, on apartheid, because we. But sometimes we're only focusing on human rights, only focusing on the occupation, only focusing on war crimes. You forget to look at the bigger picture. The occupation that started in '67 is not the beginning of the problem, right? The problem started a long time before the occupation. And this occupation that has now lasted for more than 50 years is not an occupation anymore. Actually, in international law, an occupation can be legitimate. After a war, you need to occupy the territory of the countries you won the war from. But you know, the occupation normally would be between 5, 6, 7 years. A 50 years occupation, there's no definition for such an occupation under international law. So it's morphed from an occupation to something else. And when you see and you study that the fact that there is two legal systems in the occupied territories, a settler that throws a rock won't have the same sentence that Palestinians that throw a rock. It's two different systems. There's a civil system when settlers are concerned, and the military system when the Palestinians are concerned. The case for apartheid speaks for itself. So we have to address those questions, and that's what we try to do in South Africa. Go back to the root of the problem and talk about the case of Palestine as a case of settler colonialism and apartheid. Because as Nadia mentioned, if we don't start ourselves as Palestinians, as activists, to use the proper words, you know, if we are scared to use the proper words, the media is not going to do it, and our leaders or politicians are not going to do it either. So it's important now to, a friend of mine and a great Jewish Israeli historian, Ilan Pape, talks about this all the time. The need to reframe and change the dictionary we use. You know, we were not scared to say that, you know, France was practicing colonialism in Algeria, that Belgium was, you know, a colonial power in Congo. So we shouldn't be scared to say Israel is a colonial power in Palestine. I'm going to focus a bit more on the last session we had about Gaza, because this was an extraordinary session, because what happened in Gaza was extraordinary. We decided to have this session. How long have we been speaking for? 20 minutes? That's fine. Okay. I am good. We decided to have this session because the level of the attack by Israel this time was unheard of. I had friends in Gaza, you know, and we were like Facebooking, tweeting, emailing, that told me, you know, I've lived through Operation Cast Lead, I've lived through other. This one is bigger than anything we've seen before. I mean, the level of the bombing some nights is crazy. You know, it just doesn't stop. Constant bombing. You know, a lot of my friends in Gaza were saying, "I'm going to die. There's no other way." They're bombing all over the place. There are important figures. During Operation Cast Lead, 50 tons of bombs were dropped on Gaza. 50. During Operation Protective Edge, 700 tons of bombs were dropped in Gaza. So when you see this rise in the violence, when you know, and one of our witnesses, Colonel Desmond Travers, who was part of the Goldstone report, he's an Irish colonel, he's a specialist in arms and arms used in conflict. When he testified in front of the tribunal, he told us that with the level of technology that Israel has, with the advanced weaponry that Israel has, Israel actually could be able to do precise targeting, you know, precise targeting of military targets. Sometimes maybe a few civilians can die even if it's precise, but when out of 2,100 Palestinians, 70% of them are civilians, and when you know that Israel apparently could avoid killing civilians, it raises the question of what's Israel's goal? Is it really stopping Hamas rockets? Is it really, you know, stopping the tunnels? Is it really stopping Hamas altogether? Or it's just, you know, stopping the Palestinian people altogether? So that's why we thought it was important to have this session last summer. And we thought it was important to talk about facts that the media is never talking about. I don't know how it is in Chile, but a friend of mine who works in media did a study of all the news headlines during Operation Protective Edge. I think only 2% of the newspapers mentioned the blockade, the Gaza blockade, which is quite, you know, relevant, right? If you don't mention the blockade, you forget a lot of what's happening in Gaza. If you don't mention the illegal siege, you forget You then play into Israel's hand, saying that Israel has attacked Gaza because of the rockets from Hamas. Israel responded. It was disproportionate, but they responded. The media constantly repeat that. Israel always responds to something. Israel responds to the 3 settlers that were killed in the West Bank. Israel responds to rocket attack. When you forget to put everything in an historical context, you play into the hands of the oppressor. So just a few simple facts that I'm sure you know, but that I still want to talk about. Israel is the occupying power in the West Bank, but also in Gaza. The fact that Israel took out its settlers and its army out of Gaza in 2005 doesn't mean Israel is not the occupying power anymore. I'm not, saying that. International law is very clear about this. To be actually an occupying power under international law, a physical presence doesn't matter. If you control the borders, if you control the air, if you control the sea, if you control the population registry, if you control the import and exports, you are the occupying power, and you should be taking care of the people you occupy under the 4th Geneva Convention. So actually the blockade of Gaza and the occupation of the West Bank are both acts of aggression under international law. Then another thing that, a lot of Israeli spokespeople during the war said that Israel was acting in self-defense. This is, this is bullshit. An occupying power cannot claim to act in self-defense, against the resistance from the people that you repress. That's just nonsense. And finally, obviously, the siege amounts to collective punishment, which is a crimes against humanity under the 4th Geneva Convention. So we talked during the last session about war crimes, crime against humanity, and for the first time we decided to address the question of the crime of genocide. Not because we wanted to be in or we wanted to make a fuss, but because and again, when I say we, I'm talking about people like Richard Falk, former UN envoy to Israel-Palestine, John Dugard, emeritus professor of international law, also former envoy to Israel-Palestine, Michael Mansfield, Queen Counselor, one of the most well-known lawyers in England. I'm not talking about me, Frank Barat, that doesn't know anything about law, that said that we need to talk about genocide. I'm talking about these people that are very respected and that said yes, this time. And actually John Dugard mentioned that in 2009, when he worked for a report for the Arab League after Cass led, the Arab League had asked him to look at the crime of genocide. And in 2009, John Dugard said, no, I don't think we should look into the crime of genocide. But after what happened in Gaza this time, he told us, I think we should look into genocide. Because, once again, when Israel practices collective punishment, when Israel bombs houses of civilians, when Israel... you all saw the images, the 4 kids on the beach, remember that? So, we talked about all those crimes, and when, the only problem with genocide is that it's very hard to prove that a genocide actually has taken place, because you need to prove the intent. You need to be able to prove that the people that ordered the war, being Netanyahu or the general blah blah blah, had the intention to eradicate the population of Gaza. And that's obviously very hard to prove. Nonetheless, crimes against humanity, the crime of extermination, the crime of persecution are, if you have the only a tiny bit below genocide, they are already very grave crimes. We should only focus about genocide. We have all the elements, and Amnesty International report actually gave us some more elements to talk about war crimes and crimes against humanity. This is already good enough. We had witnesses during the session that talked to us about what was happening in Israeli society itself. It's important also to remember that during the war, 95% of Israeli Jews were for the war and supported the war. You can maybe understand it on the first day of the war. They've been brainwashed. You know that Israeli kids from the earliest age have been taught that Palestinians are animals, Palestinians want to kill you. The Israeli school books, a friend of mine, Nuri Peled, an Israeli teacher, wrote this book called Palestinians in Israeli school books, to show that the use of the pictures, even the use of the colors to describe Palestinians or Palestinian villages are meant to scare people, to scare kids, you know. So when you've been brainwashed from your earliest age, and then when at 18 years old we give you an M16, a helmet, and we say, go fight, you then understand how terrible stuff can happen. So 95% of Israeli Jews were for the war, not only on the first day. After 2 weeks, the same poll was conducted again, and it was the same result. 90 to 95% were behind the war. Even after seeing the images, after seeing the videos, after seeing the reports of such an horrendous crime happening in Gaza. And the incitement and the racial hatred coming out of Israeli society in its whole. And again, we're not talking about someone posting something on Twitter. We're talking about Ayelet Shaked, who is a member of the Knesset. She's from Beitenu, the Avigor Lebanon party, who said that on media, on the mainstream media, who said Hamas is not the problem, the Palestinian people are the problem. When you have Netanyahu that calls this war a war of revenge, when you have people on social media, and when you have religious leaders, Israeli religious leaders saying we need to kill the men and the women because the women are the one giving birth to the snakes that then will attack us. I think that in any other country around the world, and maybe I'm wrong, but 99% of countries around the world, if any politicians, even if me, I was posting something like this on Facebook, I would probably be arrested the next day. In Israel, it's common knowledge, common practice, people saying those things publicly, and I'm proud, I'm proud of saying those things. So we concluded at the session that what was happening in Israeli society was an incitement to genocide. And an incitement to genocide needs to be punished. Otherwise, it can lead eventually, and I'm not Nostradamus, but it can lead eventually to a potential genocide. So what we tried to do during this session was also to raise the sort of alarm bell and say, we need to act now, as the people, but also politicians, also institutions, before it's too late. We've had example in the past, and not so long ago in Rwanda, when before '94, a lot of human rights workers, a lot of people on the ground, a lot of activists told governments, told institutions, something terrible is going to happen, all the seeds are here, we can see something big happening, something terrible is going to happen, act now. Nothing happened, and look what happened. So when you see the level of aggression Israel is capable of doing, and when Israel does this in total impunity, and that's a danger, because in a way, if tomorrow I beat up someone in the street and I get arrested, next time I think, oh, I won't beat him up. But if I beat him up and the next day I get like a reward and a medal for it, and that's what happened with Israel, and that's what's so scary. And Israeli journalists that were with us in Brussels told us the next war will be even worse. Believe me, the next war, Israel's going to go even worse. So we need to act, and that was the call of the tribunal. I'm gonna two more things, yeah. So in terms of actions and in terms of what the tribunal as recommendations, because we are a citizen popular tribunal, we don't have any power to actually implement our resolutions. The UN didn't ask us to have this tribunal. Actually, it's interesting to mention that even bodies that should and have the power to implement resolutions, they never implement it anyway. Because people often say, oh, you're a popular tribunal and you've got no judicial power, so why are you even doing it? Because, the International Court of Justice has a power, but its opinion in 2004 remained, hidden in the desk. The UN has power, but the countless of resolutions against Israel have never been respected. So it's up to us, the people, to put this to the public sphere. So it's important that what's happening in Gaza and in Palestine is addressed as a global, on a global level. Egypt role as well needs to be addressed. And the tribunal talked about the fact that the blockade of Gaza was also an Egyptian blockade. And remember that the Rafah border was closed during the whole operation. In terms of actions, as I was saying, and Nadia was saying this as well, that there is a need to change the dictionary we use. The need to talk about settler colonialism, to talk about apartheid, to talk about ethnic cleansing, and we can't be scared of that because we've got all the proof that this is what's happening. Sometimes it's hard to talk about something if you can't back your claims, but we can back our claims that with facts that what's happening in Palestine is a lot more than a simple occupation. So it's sorry, Mag. It's crucial from the pressure to come from outside, and that's why the BDS movement needs to be used as a tool from civil society to put pressure on Israel, to put pressure on corporations that are profiting from Israel's occupation, to put pressure on our elected representatives because they will not move without us putting pressure on them. There's no messiah. I remember people when Obama was elected, people were thinking like things are going to change. Nothing's changed. It's even actually worse in the Middle East. Yes. So it's down to us. The simple fact is if we don't put pressure on institutions, on our politicians, on corporations, it's not going to change. So we have to do that. Chile, for example, and we had lunch at the parliament on Tuesday and spoke to a few parliamentarians. Chile buys a lot of, or most of its military equipment from Israel. So a very simple and actually a great action would be from Chile to stop buying its military equipment from Israel, because what's going to hurt Israel is also the economy. And South Africa apartheid fell mainly because of the economy. When the banks started to divest from South Africa, apartheid fell. The legal apartheid fell, because right now there's still a sort of a social sense of apartheid in South Africa. So yeah, in Chile, a great action would be to call for a military embargo on Israel. And the free trade agreement that has been frozen right now between Chile and Israel should just not be frozen, it should be ended, as we're trying to do in Europe with the EU-Israel Association Agreement. So something that you can do, I guess, because I don't live there, but something you can do is put pressure on your politicians to, end buying Israel arms. Because I do think like Latin America is already an example, to be honest. When it comes to support for Palestine, we saw during Gaza Venezuela, Chile, Bolivia recalling their ambassadors, cutting relations with Israel. So it's great. Most of the steps are a bit sort of symbolic, but symbolism is also very important. But Latin America can be an example for the rest of the world in terms of its support with Palestine. We have to remember, finally, I'm nearly finished, that, and that's what needs to give us hope, because I'm younger than some of you, and I've been an activist from less time than some of you, and it's quite easy to feel sad and depressed when you're an activist, even more for Palestine, which is because sometimes it seems that's such a terrible case that it's never going to change. But we have to remember, we can't forget history, that most of the oppression has ended thanks to people's struggle. The Pinochet government ended, the military junta around Latin America ended, South Africa apartheid ended, and people say it's not comparable, but I was in South Africa a couple of years ago, and believe me, black people in South Africa from 48 to 1994 didn't believe that South Africa apartheid was going to fall. South Africa was supported by Reagan in the US, by Thatcher, by Israel. They had all the military might of Israel, but black South Africans kept struggling, because the struggle is a continuous one. You cannot, you either struggle when you're an oppressed people, or you die. And eventually South Africa apartheid fell. Eventually colonialism ended in Algeria, in Morocco, in Tunisia. So we have to be hopeful. No oppressive regime can last. And Israel is an oppressive regime that cannot last. And they know they are losing slowly the fight. Public opinion is completely behind Palestine now, and I think sometimes it's thanks to the Israeli actions. The crazy violence of Operation Casted, Operation Protective Edge, the attacks on the flotilla, remember the Mavi Marmara, have made public opinion realize that maybe the media was not saying the whole story. And that's something we need to use, and something we need as civil society, because the goal now is to transform this switch in public opinion, for Palestine into something, sustainable and global. When you saw like hundreds of thousands of people in the street during Operation Casted, even more during Operation Protective Edge, it's about getting those people on board, to join, BDS Palestine, BDS Chile, to join Club Palestino, to join, Federación Palestino, because we need to transform this sort of emotional outburst into concrete actions. Because, as Leilo Basso put it, Leilo Basso was the founder of the Leilo Basso Foundation that then worked on the Russell Tribunal in Latin America. He said in 1975, "We are talking about the future of mankind, when abuses of power, serious attacks on the principles of democracy, with dictatorships and oligarchies go on spreading, no country, no man will be able to retain the security of not being condemned to some form of modern slavery." And to end, I would just say that, again, I mentioned this, but that people's struggles, not a politician messiah, people's struggles have changed history and have created better places and better worlds for people. The case of Palestine, I think, is symbolic because it's symbolic of what's wrong with this world. It's like it's a case that of what's wrong with the world. It's also symbolic with the solidarity shown, internationally, with people from various walks of life, with people from different religion, different, political inclinations are joining hand by hand, like tonight, like yesterday and Monday. It's a symbol of what's possible, I think, and it's a symbol of what we, the people, can do and can achieve, because we are eventually writing history. Our politicians are not. So the fact that we are all here together is also a very exhilarating process, and this should be celebrated. And we should remember that every day we are winning some maybe small battles, but we are winning them. The fact that we are here today is another battle we've won. The fact that the BDS movement has major successes in terms of divestment from pension funds, from churches, from Israel. No, they don't divest from Israel. But churches divesting from corporations involved in Israel is something, and those actions are something we should celebrate, because it's we should celebrate the fact that life is actually beautiful, and that human civilization is actually beautiful, and that eventually we are all one, fighting, inshallah, for everyone. Muchas gracias.
Obviamente se abre el espacio para preguntas.
Allá.
Señor, usted es francés.
Sí.
y un hombre joven. Usted tiene la suerte de haber vivido y haberse cultivado en un país que en los últimos 100 años ha tenido con el mundo árabe islámico una profunda relación histórica y cultural. Además, en su país hay prensa libre y existen diarios serios como Le Monde Diplomatique que conocen y tienen periodistas en Palestina y en el mundo árabe en general. Por eso, los que estamos aquí presentes agradecemos con mucha fuerza, con profundo agradecimiento, sus expresiones claras y tan certeras, y que me atrevo a preguntarle lo siguiente. En relación a lo que yo antes le expliqué, en nuestro país pasa todo lo contrario. Nuestra prensa no se atreve. Israel en Chile se maneja, estoy hablando así de forma bien vulgar, y maneja tanto en el plano militar, tanto en el plano económico y especialmente en el plano cultural y político, cosa que nosotros, los chilenos, porque nosotros somos antes de que palestinos, somos chilenos, porque agradecemos, como somos hijos de migrantes y este país nos dio una maravillosa bienvenida, nosotros recién, ante la brutalidad del accionar del Estado de Israel, estamos actuando, y entre comillas le digo lo que usted mencionó varias veces, actuando como lucha popular, o sea que son los pueblos, o sea el pueblo palestino, ya que usted mencionó que Egipto cerró Rafa y la Liga Árabe, bla bla bla. Le pregunto finalmente, ¿cuál sería su mensaje, sobre todo que hoy día hay tantos jóvenes, tanta gente que se ha conmovido y tanta gente que ya no tiene miedo a Israel, no tiene miedo a expresarse, no tiene miedo a que en esta, la casa de los palestinos, se sigan desarrollando actividades como esta? Muchas gracias.
That's good. Yeah, got it. Should I answer this question or should I?
Tiene que responder a...
¿Es una cuestión o hay pregunta o...? Sí, yo creo que es mejor que hagamos las preguntas y después contestamos, ¿no? Es más...
Sí,
pero esta no viene. Ya, entonces, izquierdo, segundo lugar, allá atrás.
Jorge.
Perdón.
Yo tengo. Do you have the translation?
Yeah.
Okay. Primero que nada, Frank Barat, me gustaría decirle que admiro sinceramente lo que usted hace. Hoy día no es fácil decir la verdad en ninguna parte del mundo, y menos fácil es decir la verdad con respecto a las atrocidades que está cometiendo Israel. Si no, pregúntenle a Javier Bardem o a Penélope Cruz, que tuvieron la osadía de hablar con Israel en la ciudad más israelita que existe en el mundo, probablemente, que es Hollywood. Lo que se plantea aquí es una resistencia de carácter ciudadano. Sin embargo, estamos luchando contra un poder que va mucho más allá de Israel. Es un poder que domina las finanzas, domina el poder político, domina las comunicaciones, domina por lo tanto, aquí hay claramente la influencia de dinero. No creo que Israel cuente con la simpatía espontánea de todo el mundo que aparece apoyando o manteniéndose en silencio con respecto a... Aquí hay un tema de dinero. Y creo que en ese sentido el gobierno israelí y los judíos repartidos a través del mundo están manejando el poder del dinero como solamente ellos lo hacen.
¿qué cree usted que debiera ser un humilde ciudadano frente a toda esa desventaja?
Muchas gracias para tu pregunta. Mi español es muy bien. I mean, thank you for your kind words, but to be honest, I don't think there's anything admirable about what I do. You know, but thank you anyway. I think the common citizen, Nadia should answer, but I do think that I agree with you that we are fighting a bigger monster than Israel only, and actually when we came back from Via Grimaldi today, we were talking about the fact that it's important also to remember that the military governments of Latin America at the time were all about also neoliberalism. You know, the Chicago boys. So the problem obviously is much bigger than Israel only, and we are fighting a very powerful enemy. But first, we need to keep fighting. I think that's the bottom line. Secondly, again, as citizens, I think that the call that stemmed from Palestine in 2005, and again, it's important to remember because sometimes people say, why do you boycott Israel? Why don't you boycott the US? Why don't you boycott China? The simple answer is that in 2005, the Palestinian people, after trying armed resistance, after trying peaceful resistance, told us, the outside world, we are calling for a boycott of Israel. We've tried everything, it didn't work, we are calling for a boycott of Israel. Please help us and follow our, and answer our call. It's also interesting to mention, because Israel is horrified by this word, boycott, my God, boycott. But that Israel has been boycotting Palestine for many, many years before 2005. Israel boycott everything that is Palestinian. So the BDS call is crucial because first you simply answer a call from an oppressed people, and secondly it gives people, and I know that when you give conferences, when you give talks, a lot of people come back to you at the end and say that, what can I do? I'm like 18 years old, I'm a student, I'm not Jewish, Palestinian, Muslim, what can I do to help? And now with the BDS call, you actually have something concrete you can do. And again, every little step is a good one. Going to your supermarket, seeing Israeli avocados, talking to... the BDS movement is also about education. Because, and we see it in the streets of Europe, once you leaflet, you talk about BDS, people come and say, why would you boycott Israel? And then you explain, and then you start the education process. So when people say boycott is about not talking to the other one, it's completely wrong. Boycott is about talking, it's completely about talking. And it's about educating people about what's happening in Palestine. And by very little steps, boycotting Israeli goods, or can bring to a bigger change. Obviously, the whole system should be boycotted, and that's where our politicians come to the fore. But I do think that it's a crucial step, and I think that educating people about what's happening is crucial. Because I don't know Chile much. I know you are educated about Palestine, but I don't know if it's Nadia or someone else who was telling me that Chilean people with no Palestinian descent don't know what's happening in Palestine at all. Apparently the media is also doing a very, very bad job here, and the people don't know what's happening in Palestine. And for example, to link the struggles of the Chilean people with Palestine, to link the struggle of the Mapuche people with the Palestinian people, would begin, to build something much bigger. And we tried to do this also in the US when we went to New York for the session of the tribunal. Our goal was also to have black civil rights activists with us, Indian American with us. So we contacted leaders from both movements. to show them the similarities of you know, the struggles, and we were very happy that they actually came on board. So I think that's what we can do. And again, like, maybe it's not going to change tomorrow, but we have to remain certain that it will change. And yeah.
And Brian?
Well, first of all, Frank, it's nice to meet you, and I'm very pleasure to have you here. Do you have the translator right?
Are you going to speak in English? Are you going to speak in
Yeah,
Spanish?
yeah, I can, but
maybe
just for the rest of the
okay,
people to
okay.
understand. Thanks.
Muy bien.
Bueno, creo que igual que tú, muchos de los que estamos acá pensamos que quizás la primera batalla que nosotros tenemos que enfrentar hoy en día, y gracias a todo el movimiento de redes sociales que existe, es de alguna manera la guerra mediática. Creo que es el primer paso, ya que, como tal decías tú, hacia el mismo tiempo es informar a la gente, fundamental informar a las nuevas generaciones también sobre lo que está pasando. Y precisamente sobre eso, y ya que tomaste muchos puntos y, por ejemplo, muchos términos específicos para tratar y cómo tratarlos, qué cosas dejar de hablar y por qué términos transformarlos, por ejemplo, ya hablar de apartheid abiertamente y que todo el mundo lo entienda así. Quería hacerte una pregunta, porque visto desde el otro punto de vista, se habla de terrorismo, se habla de un terrorismo obviamente desde, por ejemplo, Gaza, Israel. Cuando uno escucha a los niños de Israel hablar, se habla de los terroristas, se habla que quieren que desaparezcan los terroristas. Y quería específicamente preguntarte, ustedes quizás en el tribunal obviamente han tratado mucho de eso, ¿cómo trabajan esa terminología? Cosa que cuando vengan las personas que, por ejemplo, defienden el Estado de Israel y hablan de este terrorismo, y del terrorismo obviamente masificado al Medio Oriente, ¿cómo se trabaja? ¿Cómo se, entre comillas, defiende? ¿Y por qué, por ejemplo, y entiendo obviamente que es un tema mediático, pero ¿por qué entonces nosotros podemos decir Israel es un Estado terrorista tal cual, entonces si tú lo postulas así? Quería preguntarte directamente sobre esa terminología, porque creo que es algo muy potente que hoy día en Occidente se mueve. Acá en Chile mucha gente, cuando ocurrió lo en Palestina, obviamente se dejaron llevar por los medios y se hablaba de Hamas como el grupo terrorista. Entonces mi pregunta es como, ¿hasta cuándo también permitimos eso y cómo podemos defenderlo? Gracias.
Thanks. It's a crucial question, and I mean, as far as the media is concerned, it's bad everywhere. I think when we talk about corporate mainstream media, it's the same everywhere. I was actually reading an article today on the BBC about, so you know, the BBC in England, which is meant to be one of the best channel, most neutral, most objective in the world. I was reading an article again, they were reporting on the Amnesty International report, and the way they framed it, they said Amnesty International said war crimes have been committed during the last Gaza war, a war that started because of Hamas rocket fire. So straight away, again, they play into Israel's hand by saying the war started because Hamas rocket fire. The war didn't start because of the occupation, it didn't start because of the siege, the blockade, it started because of Hamas rocket fire. But there's one thing about the mainstream media as well that because for me, like sort of mainstream media or corporate media and governments is sort of the same issue. We know that most mainstream channels sometimes feel like they are just the PR arm of the government. Before the Iraq war, when 2 million people were in the streets of London saying no to the war, the BBC, the Independent, the Guardian in the UK were still, even left-wing newspaper, advocating for the war. So the question of the mainstream media is a crucial one, but then because now we have also alternative media, we have internet, we have YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, the mainstream media can be sort of made irrelevant. I think that during Operation Cast Lead, no sort of mainstream journalist was on the ground because Israel told them to leave and they left. They were on the hill. I don't know if you remember the hill filming what was happening in Gaza. a few independent journalists were in Gaza, like my friend, Spanish friend Alberto Arce, and others. And the mainstream media suddenly depending on them to have the story. So you had actually very radical stories coming to mainstream media because they had nothing on the ground, and the only people on the ground were citizens that just showed the truth. So I think as governments, the mainstream media could be and should be made irrelevant sometimes, even if it's maybe harder in some places than others. The question about Hamas and the fact that Hamas is a terrorist organization in the US and I think even in the EU, actually they are on the terrorist list. Again, it's a very interesting one because if you start looking at the history, even like the short history of the Palestine question, I mean, Hamas was created in the late 80s, right? Was life for Palestinians perfect before the late 80s? You know? No, Israel was still occupying Palestine, bombing Palestine, killing Palestinians, occupying Jenin. You know, so the media and governments are very good at making you think that history started yesterday, but actually history started today. Hamas sends rockets, you know, Hamas is a terrorist organization. But if you look even further, remember that before Hamas was created, Fatah was a terrorist organization. You know, before, you know, the thing is about Israel, whoever is in power is going to be a terrorist, and you know, there's no partner for peace. And Mahmoud Abbas is not a partner for peace. Arafat was a terrorist. So this is just, but they are very good. I mean, we have to admit they are very good at what they do. You know, because for public opinion, I mean, even in France, when you have debates between, let's say, a pro-Palestinian, and often the pro-Palestinian is so much better than the pro-Israeli, but the pro-Israeli is going to say just all the time a few words, you know. First they say Hamas, you notice? Hamas, which is already, you know, Hamas, it's like aggressive. Hamas, terrorist, children, human shields, Islam, that now they mix, you know, Hamas with the Islamic State, they're the same, Bin Laden, Hamas. So for people that understand the conflict, you know, those words are very powerful. Terrorist, children as human shields, and so they are very good at that. But the fact is, like as you said, Israel practices state terrorism, and we have all the evidence to show that. So when people say Hamas is a terrorist organization, I mean, again, we have to remember under international law, an occupied people has the right to defend itself against its occupier by every means, including arms. Then, and I have to be clear about this as well, under international law, firing, discriminately firing rockets towards civilian populations could, and we have to study it, but could also be a war crime. But we cannot put on the same level the means used by the occupied people and the means used by the occupier. And that's what I always say to people. Hamas is obviously not perfect, Fatah is not perfect, the Socialist Party is not perfect, you know, but no party is perfect. But we need to focus on the occupier. We will criticize Hamas or Fatah once Palestine is free, once Palestine is a real sort of liberated country. Then let's look at Hamas's actions or Fatah's action. Right now, Palestine is occupied. Let's focus on the occupiers.
Even Nelson Mandela was called terrorist.
Yes, of course. Nelson Mandela was actually, they took him out of the terrorist list in like the late 90s or something. So,
yeah. Bueno, primero que nada, muchas gracias por la exposición, muy interesante. Mi pregunta tiene que ver con las acciones. Creo que estamos en un momento donde nos preocupamos mucho de la media, de cómo decirlo, de cómo hacerlo, y todo lo encuentro muy válido. Pero para nosotros es un lujo tener una persona del Tribunal Russell hoy día aquí hablando y comentando las conclusiones de lo que se ve. Sin embargo, justamente tú mencionabas, hoy mismo está siendo la mezquita bombardeada, hoy mismo siguen todos los problemas en el día a día. Yo creo que muchos de nosotros, yo también no voy a decir que soy muy joven ni muy vieja, pero acá la verdad que hay mucha gente que lleva muchos años viendo esto y que las conversaciones se pasan de cómo lo decimos, de cuáles son las comunidades que somos más activas, menos activas. Yo creo que hoy día mi pregunta hacia ti tiene que ver con cómo transferir esta opinión pública o las herramientas que el Tribunal Russell nos está dando, como son estos reportes, o el reporte de Amnistía, o el reporte de Human Rights Watch, o los mismos reportes de UN, si tú quieres, para poder realmente influenciar a los políticos que justamente, the enablers that you were mentioning, those ones are the ones that at the end are continuing and allowing this to continue. So my question is what we can do. Sorry that I'm checked to, I was studying in English. What is a real thing that not a normal, even the government, like institutions, tribunals, like what needs to be done in order to link politicians and polls? Yesterday, the Republicans just win the Congress. Yesterday. That means that we're all in trouble, you know. If we were in trouble before, we are now really in trouble. So I want to know what's going on in terms of how or what are the tools that the Russell Tribunal can bring to the table so we link into and reach the politicians that allow that blank check for this to continue happening. Thank you so much.
Again, that's the very interesting question, and the politicians, they are all not bad, of course, but most of the time, I'm saying this in case there are a few in the audience. You know, I'm just being very pragmatic. You know, politicians, the bottom line is they want to be elected, and they want to be re-elected, right? So the day they will understand that Palestine has become such an issue that if they don't take a stand and actually change their policy on Palestine, they won't get re-elected, would make a difference. They're very pragmatic, you know. They like this. Remember, I mean, the history of it's like George Orwell's book 1984. You know, Oceania is bad one day, and the next day it's enemy, and the next day, once Israel is not going to be useful to them, once they're not going to get votes because they support Israel, they will stop supporting Israel. But then the question is, before we reach this point, and the fact that when we talk about politicians also, I mean, our democracies are so not democracies, you know what I mean? Like, we have the right to vote every 4 years, or 5 years? 4? You have the right to vote every 4 years. Be happy, it's a democracy. Woo. But once you voted, that's it. Normal democracy. So there's a broader question about what's democracy and how we are truly represented by politicians. The fact that there are, thanks to popular pressure in Europe, the fact that Sweden recognized Palestine, that the UK hopefully is going to do it soon, that France is going to do it soon, is thanks to popular pressure. And it's again because politicians have realized, because of the advocacy work and the lobby work, that people even of no Jewish or of Palestinian descent care about Palestine, and the Palestinians became a crucial issue, has pushed them to change. But then, and maybe look at the what the media call the Arab Spring, which are in fact ongoing revolutions. The governments around this time were made completely irrelevant. Completely. I mean, the government of the countries of Tunisia, of Egypt, were made completely irrelevant because the people. That's what direct democracy is about, right? You don't, instead of going okay, we don't like Mubarak anymore, we're going to ask our representative, or we're going to wait 4 years to vote him out, or we're going to ask our representative to vote him out, that we don't like Mubarak anymore, we're going to go to the presidential palace and get Mubarak out. That's what happened. Same for Ben Ali. So the governments were made irrelevant of Tunisia and Egypt and the rest, but the governments of Western states were made irrelevant as well. Obama was like a week before Mubarak was kicked out, Obama was still supporting Mubarak. And then when he understood that Mubarak was over, he was like, I'm with the people of Egypt and France. What's her name? Ali Omari, which was like the Ministry of Interior, 2 weeks before Ben Ali was kicked out, was in holiday in Ben Ali's palace. A big friend of Ben Ali. So the governments, by our actions, were made completely irrelevant. But in terms of action that we can do, and I think talking about the legal actions against Israel itself are impossible, because actually there are no courts that can judge a country. The ICC, the International Criminal Court, can judge individuals, and the Palestinian Authority and the PLO should ratify the Rome Statute and should go to the ICC. There are underlying questions, but they should do it. And I think everyone says so, the Palestinian people say so as well, because even though Israel hasn't ratified the ICC, and even though it's unlikely that even if they are convicted, Israeli generals or Israeli politicians will be taken to The Hague, the simple fact that they will be found guilty will mean that every other state that has ratified the International Criminal Court will have to arrest them if they step foot in the state. And again, we're talking about Israel. Israel is very much linked to Europe. Israeli politicians have a lot of business in Europe, have a lot of family in Europe. So the day you're telling General Almog, okay, you're not going to be in jail, but you actually cannot leave Israel anymore, or you'll be arrested, that will be the beginning of the end of the impunity of Israel. That would be the beginning of the accountability of Israel. And this is very scary for Israel. Then there's also legal action that we can take. I know in Belgium and in the UK, we started with, I've created a charity to take over the work of the tribunal, which is called the Palestine Legal Action Network, that intends to turn the findings of the tribunals that are only words into concrete actions. So I'm working with lawyers and jurists in the UK and in Belgium. We will, in 2015, start legal actions against a Belgian and a British supermarkets that are still storing Israeli goods in their supermarkets. So again, that's a little steps, but once you start the legal process, it can build to something bigger. So again, I think we just need to continue fighting, and we need to be very optimistic that when we are millions on the streets for Palestine, supporting Palestinian rights, we will be victorious, inshallah, one day.
Thank you so much.
If you have answer, just tell me. I don't have
Barat, voy a hacer mi pregunta en español.
Sí.
Voy a hacer mi pregunta en español.
Sí, sí.
If you could use your translator device, I appreciate it. Primero que nada, quisiera agradecer porque hace tiempo que no escuchaba una charla donde en lugar de hablar de guerra entre israelíes y palestinos se habla directamente de invasión, porque una guerra requiere al menos una simetría entre partes. Es algo para ir aclarando. Segundo, respecto del término apartheid, que se está utilizando mucho en estos últimos tiempos, Noam Chomsky en una columna de hace algunos meses atrás señala que opina que no es correcto usar el término apartheid porque los palestinos simplemente viven una situación peor que los negros en Sudáfrica. En primer lugar, los blancos requerían la fuerza laboral, aunque sea una fuerza laboral barata, de los negros. Su idea era mantenerlo, eran ciudadanos de segunda clase. En el caso de los palestinos era simplemente los israelíes buscan una limpieza étnica y limpiar el territorio de palestinos. De hecho, cuando uno escucha la prensa, esto se puede ver incluso al ver la prensa israelí, que no se habla derechamente de palestinos, sino que se habla de árabes o de los otros. Tú como francés seguramente Albert Camus lo conoces cuando hablaba de en el libro en el extranjero, se refería a los otros. Nunca se refería a los argelinos o a los árabes que vivían en Argelia, tampoco a los africanos, eran simplemente los otros. Bueno, y brevemente una pregunta, me gustaría si pudiera desarrollar un tema que me parece bastante importante porque tiene relación con la conclusión a que llegó el tribunal y en relación al boicot hacia Israel. Y esto es, me gustaría que termines de desarrollar una idea que me pareció un punto muy importante que dice relación por qué es un contraargumento que utilizan quienes están en contra del boicot hacia Israel. ¿Por qué boicotear productos israelíes y no, por ejemplo, boicotear productos norteamericanos? Estados Unidos también viola los derechos humanos, también ha realizado guerra, por ejemplo, en el caso de Irak, contra Irak, ha invadido Afganistán al borde de las resoluciones de la Naciones Unidas, sin respetar los mandatos de la Naciones Unidas, sin respetar la Carta Fundamental de la Naciones Unidas. Eso es. Muchas gracias.
Yeah, so the first point was about apartheid. Okay, when we talk about apartheid, about Palestine, we're actually not comparing Israeli apartheid with South African apartheid. Apartheid in 1973, with the UN Convention for the Suppression of the Crime of Apartheid, became an international crime. It obviously stemmed from what happened in South Africa and Namibia in the 40s, 50s, 60s, etc. But apartheid became an international crime, which means that to be an apartheid state, you don't have to tick all the boxes that, sort of, for example, South Africa ticked. The definition of apartheid under international law is, first you need to have two people. And in Israel-Palestine, there are clearly two people, Palestinians or Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews. You need to establish that one people has overwhelming privileges over another people, and that one people, throughout a systematic and institutionalized discrimination, is discriminating against the other. And again, we can see when it comes to Israel-Palestine that it's clearly the case. So the apartheid analogy is also some sort of a pragmatic one, I agree. And I think the movement, the sort of pro-justice, pro-Palestine movement, has decided to go with the apartheid road because people know what apartheid means. You know, some people actually, the tribunal talked about sociocide when it comes to Palestine, talked about politicide when it comes to Palestine, and there are also terms that are very much applicable to what's happening. But in the head of people, if you say sociocide, you sort of complicate things, you know, and you need to explain what sociocide is. Apartheid is very clear. Apartheid means separation, means one people, you know, oppressing another, and people get this. But if you compare it to South Africa, I agree that the situation is different, but we are not comparing with South Africa. We are applying the definition of apartheid under international law to Israel regime. Yeah, about boycott, why not boycotting the US? Again, I think because the Palestinian people have asked us to boycott Israel. And the day the US citizens will ask us to boycott the US, we can do it. I'm sort of joking, but I think, again, it's a pragmatic call from the Palestinian people. Even if Israel is powerful, it's still easier to boycott Israel's product, Israeli economy, that is actually a tiny economy compared to the rest of, you know, Israel is a tiny country, than boycotting the US, which is the master of the world, you know, but, or wants to be, or, you know, and I think in a way, you know, by boycotting Israel, by boycotting Israeli goods, you are also somehow boycotting the US, because they are so linked, you know, together. And actually there are also calls from the US, from student groups, from churches, to actually boycott US corporations that work in Israel. So, you know, it's a call that we answer from the Palestinians, and it's a pragmatic call, I agree. But because to boycott the US would be, I don't know, you don't know where to start, I think. Yeah. You have to put ketchup.
Yo un paréntesis, pero en verdad incluso el boicot a Israel no es el boicot que todos suelen creer que es, como boicotear una lista inagotable de marcas. En verdad el boicot a Israel está muy precisado por el Comité Nacional de Boicot, que está en Ramallah, en Palestina. Y por ejemplo, en tanto el boicot económico, que es el boicot más conocido, en verdad boicoteamos los productos hechos en Israel y en territorios ocupados palestinos, y solo algunos transnacionales que tienen un rol activo en perpetuar las violaciones de derechos humanos que hace Israel. Por ejemplo, G4S, que proporciona elementos a la seguridad israelí, los bulldozers marca Caterpillar, HP, que también hace parte de los sistemas de control de Israel. Entonces son cuestiones súper específicas que están publicadas en la página del BDS y eso según se decidió allá en Palestina. Pero cierro paréntesis.
Bueno, y por razones de tiempo, bueno, ya insiste la última pregunta, pero finalizamos con la respuesta de Frank. Agradecer por supuesto a todos los presentes, al club y a los organizadores, y por supuesto a Frank por haber querido estar en Chile y en la Casa de los Palestinos, el Club Palestino. Y terminamos con tu respuesta a la pregunta.
Hoy una pregunta bien cortita, precisa y concisa. ¿Por qué Palestina está todo el tiempo amenazando con que se va a unir a todas las organizaciones mundiales y nunca lo hace? Está amenazada Palestina, está presionada. Eso es.
There's lots of good questions tonight. It's I think you've answered the question yourself. There are, the question of the International Criminal Court, which is, a right that Palestine has to go to the International Criminal Court. Palestine, just to do this, is facing huge pressure from Europe and the US not to do so. We saw that when Palestine joined UNESCO, the US cut all the funds to UNESCO. And the ICC is really a step above UNESCO in terms of ending Israeli impunity. So the Palestinians first have, European member states tell them, don't go this route, negotiations are the road to peace. They've got the US saying, if you do this, we'll just get everything, you won't get any money. Obviously they've got Israel saying, if you go to the ICC, we probably withhold taxes, they do that all the time, Israel could just bomb them again. Still, there is also a key question to be answered by the Palestinian Authority that you're right, is sort of branding this carrot or this stick saying, no, we will do this one day, but they actually, you're right, don't do it. Yes, they will face repercussions and pressures, but I'm not the only one to think, and I think a majority of the Palestinian people think that the situation is that bad that they can face something even worse. But if Palestine goes to the ICC, it'll be, for the first time for many years from the Palestinian Authority, taking a stand against Israel and saying, okay, enough negotiations, we've negotiated for 20 years and we see the result. Now it's going to be our right to legal actions and to concrete actions. So it's a call to be answered by the Palestinian Authority, but from people I know that work inside the Palestinian Authority, from people I know that advise the Palestinian Authority on those legal aspects, it looks like the Palestinian Authority will go to the ICC in 2015 at one point. But again, I'm not too optimistic because they've said this before many times, but you know what they want to do, right? They want first to put a UN resolution at the Security Council asking for Israel to withdraw from occupied Palestine in the next 5 years. So that's the tactic. They're going to put a resolution in January to the UN Security Council to ask the UN Security Council to vote a resolution that will say Israel needs to withdraw from the occupied territories in the next 5 years. I'm not sure I understand the strategy, because we know the US will veto the resolution once again. So if Palestine needs to prove once again that the US supports Israel, I'm not really sure, we know that. But anyway, they want to go do this first, and then if the UN veto the resolution, they will go to the ICC. But people, and John Dugard, for example, who is a jury of the tribunal and advises the Palestinian people on these matters, I saw him a month ago in London, and he told me, Frank, I do believe that they will go to the ICC in 2015, around springtime. So, fingers crossed.
Muchas gracias. Agradecer también a la productora Andrea Javo por la gran producción.
Vamos a invitar a comer. Un jueguito de